Okay, I see we have a number of people joining. We'll get started in a minute. Probably one more minute and then we'll get started. And we're now live on Facebook. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Dr. Reid, thank you for joining us. So hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining another Outcomes for Me Ask the Expert webinar. Today, we're delighted to welcome breast oncologist, Dr. Sonya Reid from Vanderbilt-Ingram Cancer Center. Dr. Reid's research focuses primarily on health disparities in breast cancer, the young onset of the disease, and hereditary risk. She feels strongly about the value of clinical trials, as you'll see through this discussion in breast cancer, and is dedicated to educating patients about the potential place of clinical trials in a treatment plan, which is the subject of our webinar today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Maya Saeed. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Outcomes for Me. Outcomes for Me wants to help and empower breast cancer patients with the tools and resources to better navigate their care. Through our mobile app and website, patients can access free resources and information, including clinical trials, to help manage your disease. The format of today's discussion will be primarily a Q&A discussion. We got a number of questions that were submitted from our users ahead of this webinar, which we'll go through it. But also, please feel free to ask live questions via the chat or the Q&A button on Zoom or on Facebook by posting them on Facebook. So let's get started. Thank you again for joining us, Dr. Reid. So before we get to the questions, any opening remarks, regarding your background, but also your passion about clinical trials?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Maya. So I'm a breast medical oncologist, and what that means essentially is that I treat patients in the clinic with breast cancer, all stages of breast cancer. But then on the research side, I do focus on health disparities as it relates to breast cancer. And I do have a passion for ensuring that we have adequate representation across all different racial ethnic groups, socioeconomic groups within our clinical trials that essentially shape how we treat our patients. Just to give maybe an overview or just a big picture view of clinical trials before we get into some of the questions, I always like to say to my patients when I talk about clinical trials in the clinic, clinical trials essentially give patients a lot of times access to therapies a lot of times before they become FDA approved, right? And that is something that I always, especially in breast cancer, especially along the later, towards the later stages of treatment, that is critical. But more importantly, what I always stress, the treatment a patient gets today was a clinical trial at some point, right? And I think that's something that we always have to remember as we embark on the discussions, and even when patients volunteer to be a part of a clinical trial, is that we would not have any of our therapies that we have today without a patient being a part of a clinical trial at some point for that specific drug. And again, another part of it, when we think about clinical trials, we always want to remember that clinical trials are really how we improve care along the cancer care continuum. So we have clinical trials that span from early detection to diagnosis, treatment, all the way to survivorship. And there are different clinical trials along that spectrum, if you may. And then another critical part, it's always voluntary, right? Clinical trial participation is 100% something that you can choose to even opt out of, even after you have said yes. You can change your mind. That's absolutely okay. And of course, I guess I'll leave it there and take some questions after, but that's what I really wanted to stress.
Yeah, and thank you very much for providing that context, because one thing we do found a lot, I think there's this big misconception of what clinical trials are for. And one of the big things, as you mentioned, is sometimes clinical trial is the best treatment options that are available to patients. So with that, the way we got questions, and again, just to remind everybody that, you can ask questions live on Facebook or directly here in the chat. But I want to start with a number of more broader questions that we received that, I would call clinical trials 101. So could you please help us understand the difference between different phases of clinical trial? Is one phase better than or safer than the other? How do people think about, these clinical trials and what phases mean?
Absolutely. So A new treatment essentially can go through different phases, right? And each phase has a different purpose. So phase 1 clinical trial essentially is testing the safety of that drug, right? So this could be a new treatment or even a combination of 2 treatments that have not been used together to really understand, is that safe? It's usually tested in a smaller group of patients, right? And then we move to phase 2 clinical trials, which essentially is trying to understand, does this treatment work? Is it effective for a specific indication? And then we have stage 3 clinical trial that is essentially trying to compare a new treatment to a standard of care treatment that we already have. Or it may be that we're using a similar treatment, not different, but similar. But is it similar with less side effects, right? So maybe it's not better, but maybe it's a new drug that have similar efficacy, but now with less side effects. And that's something that we usually test in a bigger, usually we're looking at hundreds of patients now in phase 3 clinical trials, right? And then there is phase 4 clinical trials that can be done. It's not always done, but it's sometimes after a drug is FDA approved. Sometimes there may be a stipulation, for example, where we're trying to get more long-term data on that drug, on that new drug, to understand safety profiles in thousands of patients now after it's rolled out to the market.
Great. And is it better to join one trial versus the other in terms of its phase?
Not really. It really depends on what that trial is and what that patient is going through at that point, right? So for example, a patient is seeing their doctor and they're trying to understand, is there a clinical trial, right? Very open-ended question. Do I have a clinical trial that I'm eligible for? That will essentially open up the entire portfolio. So you may see some phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. I will say, however, that patients, usually patients with metastatic breast cancer, right, at later stage of diagnosis where they're running out of treatment options, if you may, those are sometimes where you find a lot more phase 1 studies. So we're trying to really get at a novel therapy that may not have been approved or for a while, right? So you're trying to get, is there anything, right? We're really scraping the bottom at that point. So it really depends.
It depends. And we just got a live question from Marie, which is actually a very good one. So the question is, why do the trials always go for maximum dose needed instead of the minimum dose needed? And I assume, especially on the early stage, like the phase 1s or 2s, that would minimize the bad side effects that we have to suffer through. So a question around how trials are actually designed.
Yeah, and that is usually what comes up in the phase 1 setting, right? And that's something that's done with a lot of oversight, extreme oversight in safety, right? Because that's what we're looking for, that safety signal. And at that point, we're really trying to understand how well can we get a drug to work in the subset, because we're going to take it to phase 2, right? So you're trying to get the best dose with the least amount of side effects. So that's a very tight, well-oiled machinery, essentially, where you're really trying to understand how best can we treat this particular cancer, but still rid patients of side effects.
Okay, thank you. Are the results from trials shared with participants along the way? And how will, we have a question, how will I know if it is actually working?
Yeah, that's a good one, actually. I guess I'll answer the second part of the question first. So how you would know a drug is working while you're on a trial is really the same way that you would if you were not on a trial, right? So if, for example, you're getting scans every 3 months if you have metastatic disease, that would be the same if you're on a trial. If anything, it actually may be more frequent monitoring, because sometimes, depending on the clinical trial, instead of the standard every 3 months, you actually may be getting scans every month, just to make sure that, as I said, clinical trials have so much oversight, and you really are trying to make sure that you're precise. So a lot of times the frequency of scans is actually more than what would have been the case if you were not a part of that study, right? So you will absolutely be aware if that drug is working. as you would have, or even more frequently. And then the second part of the question was asking about data sharing, essentially, right? And that's actually a mandate. It's a mandate, but it's not along the way, right? It's usually after that clinical trial has been completed, the results have been analyzed, and the results have been summarized. So it would not be your results or like individually, but that data would be presented likely at a conference maybe, but also published as public data and there's some nuances, and we're trying to get better at that to make sure that it's actually going back to the patients that volunteered for that study, but that information should actually be out there in the public. That way you see what was the result of that study. It summarized, right? Not usually for patient X versus patient Y.
Yeah, no, that's what I do want to emphasize. Actually, a point you just said. I had a friend who went through breast cancer and actually went to us on a trial, and the frequency of scans, the frequency of follow-up, because her experience going through trials and then getting off a trial to to kind of post-trial is she felt she got much better care irrespective of the intervention because of that additional oversight that happens in the clinical trial setting.
Absolutely. Always. I always tell a lot of my trial patients, they call themselves VIP because they have, all the extra, bells and whistles, not only with frequent monitoring, but just that extra support staff that comes, because we want to be vigilant that if there is a safety signal, because even after passing through a phase 1 study, when you start testing X drug in among more patients, you may get more signals that you want to make sure you don't miss them, right? So there is definitely some oversight and some thought into why we're this vigilant. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We got another question, so I'll read it as is. I'm an early stage survivor, and I obviously want to do everything I can to prevent a recurrence. Are there trials for survivors, or are they for stage 4 only?
That's a great question, and I think I alluded to it a tiny bit earlier on. When we think about cancer, I always like to think of it as along the cancer control continuum, right? So that's from risk factors to prevention, early detection, diagnosis, treatment, survivorship, end of life, right? And there are trials along that continuum. So yes, absolutely, there are trials out there for breast cancer survivors, right? Because we know that quality of life is an issue, right? So there are trials that actually focuses just on that. How can we improve one's quality of life after they've gone through breast cancer treatment? How can we reduce recurrence for getting a second breast cancer, right? So all those things are wrapped up in the survivorship domain, and we absolutely always are looking for patients that are willing to be a part of these studies.
Okay, great. We also just got a live question that is linked to also these longer term studies. So the question is, and I don't know to which extent you kind of have it off the top of your head, but are there any trials for AI aromatase inhibitors that show that they should be given over 10 years for hormone positive cancer? It seems hormone positive cancer recurred after 10 years. Any new AI trials that have side effects, so have less side effects? And actually, maybe I'll also add a broader question, which is, a lot of, a big part of breast cancer obviously is metastatic, but it's early stage, and kind of, these longer term trials, do they exist? How are they done? That would be helpful to understand.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's a great one. I think currently we have in the past have studies that have tried to look at, is there a role for extending endocrine therapy past that 10-year mark? And we have not shown where that is effective without compromising comorbidities, right? When we think of cardiovascular, joints, bone health, etc. So at this point, we don't have any prior studies that points us in that direction. So I think I can't say for sure. I would have to check to see if there's any ongoing or new ones coming down the pipeline, but that has been looked at in the past. And we have not seen where it is effective to continue giving endocrine therapy past that 10-year mark at this point, at least not alone. Are there studies, and there are definitely some studies looking at maybe combination strategies with endocrine therapy and some other novel agents to kind of try to look at, can we really reduce the risk of these late recurrences, which are a big issue. And I think we actually have one such study here at Vanderbilt.
Okay, great. Actually, speaking of that, so we got a question, which is, what happens if people join a trial? Specifically, who will be in charge of my care? I heard if I join the trial, I get transferred to the oncologist running the trial, but I don't want to give up my current doctor. I love my team.
That's awesome. Love when patients feel, like they got a good team.
They love you, doctor.
Right.
Yeah.
So the goal is never to uproot a patient from their team, right? So that's the goal. It's always to allow a patient to remain at their institution. That way they're in their community. However, we do know that there's some instances where you're treated may not have that clinical trial available, which then will mean you having to travel to a different site, whether that's in the same city or even sometimes across state, right? So those instances, of course, then you'd have to change your primary doctor if you're traveling to another institution. But for example, if you're in that institution, and I'll use Vanderbilt as an example where I am at, and I have a trial here that I am the principal investigator on, a patient that's seen another oncologist would not transfer her care to me. I am the site PI, but you would still be seen by your doctor. I'm just the one that kind of have the oversight on the big trial. But of course, you will be seeing your oncologist as you're going along.
How about if we take that example? How about if it's a patient that's in Nashville, but not being seen at a doctor at another institution, not Vanderbilt, and then they want to get on a trial that you're running? How would that work?
So in order to be on a trial, you would have to be at that site. So you won't necessarily have to be seen by me, but that trial would have to be open at that site. So as you know, a lot of times there are clinical trials that are open at multiple sites, right? So even in the case of you being, let's just make it up, in New York, right? And I have this study open at Vanderbilt, you can go to an institution in New York that has that exact study open as well and be seen by said oncologist there.
Okay, great. Another question we got, actually, we provide some of that, but are you aware of services to help me find a trial?
Yeah. A lot of them. Outcomes for me here is a platform that utilizes that. But I always say, talk to your oncologist, right? If that oncologist that you're seeing doesn't bring up a study, be the one to bring it up. Be your biggest advocate. Ask, are there any trials that are right for me? Because a lot of time that oncologists may be privy to studies that are coming down the pipeline that may not even be available online as yet. But clinicaltrials.gov is another resource that can be utilized where you can put in your type of cancer, the location, similar to what you can do with the Outcomes for Me platform. But there are multiple different tools online that you can use to get that information.
Yeah, and I do want to emphasize something you said, because we actually have a lot of people that use Outcomes for Me that, the notion that, bringing up trials to your doctor, because they may not be aware of a trial if it's not running at the site, and it doesn't mean that trial may not be the right one for you. And this is, I'll just kind of, share that, this is also part of Outcomes for Me mission, right? It's really to kind of empower people to really know all their options, but also start the conversation with their providers around those options. And we do use clinicaltrials.gov. That's kind of, that's why things always are updated. But absolutely, no, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I have patients that come to me all the times asking me about a trial, and I welcome that because sometimes, again, you may not be in the know about everything. Patients are in different support groups, websites, and different blog groups, et cetera, and they find out about a trial that maybe a friend or someone else was on, and then that will be an opportunity for us to look into that to see, is this right for you?
Great, thank you. Here's another question. I'll read it as is. So I don't want to join a clinical trial until I have run out of the approved drugs for my type of cancer. Can you explain why I should not think that way?
Yeah, I always say being proactive is always the right thing to do, especially in the case of metastatic breast cancer, where we never want to have treatment delays, right? So you always want to be thinking one step ahead, wherein at least you're aware of, okay, if I get a scan back and it doesn't look good, we're not scampering around trying to think about what next. So I always think, try to be proactive and try to be thinking what's down the pike. Is there something that is here? Am I to be thinking about going elsewhere next? Being proactive is always the right thing, because again, what you're doing by being proactive is making sure that you're not delaying your care.
Great, thank you. And actually, so we also had just a live question, and just a reminder, you can ask a question anytime in the Q&A button if you're on Zoom or on Facebook directly. So I'll read it. So this is a person that she says, I'm a survivor of 1 year. How do we get into a trial for survivors? My oncologist said there aren't any trials currently for early stage cancer. I have an aggressive type and want to make sure I don't have recurrence or mets. I would love to be in one for AI side effect treatment. I think I have every side effect. So maybe let me broader kind of, and actually link to that, are there any new aromatase inhibitors, or are mostly all the endocrine therapy coming out with less side effects? So, and we get this question all the time, you know, like there's a lot of metastatic breast cancer trials, but there's also a lot of early breast cancer trials, and some of them are in this maintenance phase. But maybe if you want to share, you know, your thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. And I think this is a great one. So just to kind of go back in stages of what that question was unpacking. So I think the first thing that patient did was ask their doctor, right? You ask, are there trials? The doctor said no, at least not that they were aware of. So the next step I always say is then go to clinicaltrials.gov. Outcomes for me to see if there are other trials that your doctor just may not know about, right? So that's the next step that you should always take to just to kind of make sure that maybe there are studies elsewhere. And if it is that you're motivated or have the resources to try to look into that option, then that would be an option that you would obviously then open up to yourself. But specifically as it relates to, are there other endocrine therapy or options in the early stage settings? We know that there are oral SERDs, or selective estrogen receptor down regulators, that we have been now exploring a lot of in the metastatic setting. That's now coming in the earlier setting. And there are a lot of trials that are now underway in development and even in the early stages that are looking at these oral SERD agents to essentially try to hopefully have less side effects and actually be more effective. But again, it will take some time to get this through clinical trials for us to have this information to even say that this is similar or better. So that's going to be a part of our journey as we explore these options in the next couple of years.
Great, thank you. Another question we got, can you try in a trial that is not blinded, so you know that you are actually getting the research drug?
Absolutely. So we have blinded studies and we have unblinded studies, right? And because clinical trials are voluntary, you can always opt to, maybe that's your preference, where you say, you know what, if this study is going to be blinded, I do not want to be a part of that study. And that is absolutely okay.
And many studies, if I'm not mistaken, for in cancer are not blinded, right?
A lot of them are not.
Yeah, a lot of them are not, right? Yeah,
a lot of them are not. It's a little hard because a lot of our side effect profiles are very clear. So patients would figure it out some way. along the line. But we do have some blinded studies where, for example, if we're testing something placebo versus something else that a patient doesn't know, and sometimes even the clinician doesn't know because it's double blinded. So that does happen too.
Great, thank you. We got a couple of questions on the live. Actually, one of them, I don't know if you know it or not, so I'll just say it, but I'll tell Marie, you know, you can always ask those questions on the Outcomes for Me app, and our team of nurse practitioners could look up any specific trial that you're interested in or any trials for your specific situation. But I don't know if you know, so the question is, what do you know about the Orion 101 trial? She wasn't sure if the spelling is correct, and I don't know if you know any of it, but let me ask the second question. My oncologist told me that the oral SERD should be approved this year by FDA. Do you believe that? I should also say that we're going to have a webinar with Dr. Sarah Terlini from Dana-Farber after the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium. So I don't know if there's results coming there, but that are linked to the SERDs, but you know, to the extent that we'll be able to cover those.
Absolutely, and that will be exciting. I think we have all been long awaiting some data on oral SERD, and hopefully at San Antonio next week, or big San Antonio Breast Cancer Conference is next week. So there's definitely some results that will be coming out there. So I guess I would say stay tuned. I don't know, because being approved this year, we only have one more month. So I think that would be very ambitious and optimistic. I don't think this year, but hopefully very soon.
So let me, I'm going to cover a few questions that we got that's in the safety bucket of trials. So the first question is, how do I know it is safe to participate in a clinical trial? I'm worried it will do more harm than good.
Yeah, and I think that's a great one. And what I always want to stress, they're regulatory and whether internal and or government agencies that have great oversight before you even become a part of a study, right? So clinical trials have to have a lot of preclinical data and phase 1 data, for example, in the case of phase 3 studies, to make sure that this study is safe in human subjects, right? But these regulatory bodies have policies in place essentially just for that, to ensure patient safety. It is the utmost priority. Yes, we want better treatment for patients, but the first thing we want to make sure that we're doing that in a safe manner. So clinical trials, and I think we kind of have been alluding to that some throughout this conversation, and I really want to harp on that fact. So I do appreciate this question, but that is how we ensure safety, from getting that data, those preclinical data and even pilot data earlier on. That way we're sure before we start rolling out such X drug, for example, to more patients, hundreds and thousands of patients.
Great, and also linked to any common risks associated with clinical trial participations, any things that people should be aware of that, just, on their mind? Yeah,
so there's always the risk of side effects, right? And I think that's with anything, right? With any drug, but that risk also goes up on a clinical trial because this is a newer drug, right? So, and that's why we make sure that we do such extensive and frequent monitoring, right? Because sometimes side effects do catch us off guard, if you may, where we didn't see the signal earlier, and then the signal becomes more apparent as we start testing it in more patients, right? So that is an inherent risk just with how clinical trials are. But again, that's a minimal risk. And sometimes, of course, we always say that risk-benefit ratio is a discussion that you always have, especially in the context of oncology and breast cancer treatments.
Yeah, and actually this some of what you said in this answer and the answer before relates, I think, to the next question, which is maybe this notion of independent safety board. So I'll read the question as is, that way kind of we can answer it. Is, I know pharma companies benefit from clinical trials, and I am worried that they will push a drug that isn't completely safe. Is there a third party that monitors how they run the trial and review the medicine? Will that review process continue throughout the trial?
Yeah, so There's absolutely the FDA that's a part of that. A lot of times, depending on these trials, there's also, as Maya mentioned, the independent safety committees that are part of that. You have oncologists like myself that are sometimes a part of these safety bodies. There's so many checks and balances, right, that are independent from the pharma companies. But I would always say the FDA, at the end, if there's anything that we think is going to compromise safety, that trial will not go forward and that drug will not be approved, no matter what that pharmaceutical company results was or intention. Like that's what we, give our tax dollars for, essentially, is to have the FDA. And I always want to mention this point because I don't think some folks may know this, but the FDA, for example, have breast medical oncologists that are trained as breast cancer doctors that actually approve any breast cancer drug that gets out there. Within the FDA, you also have breast medical oncologists that work directly on all breast cancer trials to make sure that at the end of the day, the breast cancer drugs that are getting out there are the best drugs, are safe for the patients, and that is what they do. I have colleagues that work within the FDA that are breast cancer doctors, that is their job.
Okay, thank you. One more question on this topic, and actually I think this is a very common question that maybe a misunderstanding or misperception of cancer clinical trials in particular. So the question is, what if I am given the placebo instead of the medicine to the trial is studying? Does that mean I consented to not being treated for my cancer at all? And maybe kind of, explaining how actually cancer trials work, which is what are they compared to, and what's the alternative if it's not the drug that's being studied?
That's a great question, and something that I think a lot of patients actually have a misperception about. So when we think about placebo, most times in cancer, and I'll just make this conversation about breast cancer if it's okay. Most times when we think about placebo, it is it specifically referring to if no treatment was supposed to be the standard. For example, if you finished your breast cancer treatment and you are just going to be in surveillance, meaning you're just being monitored, right? So that was the standard. And now we're trying to say can drug X reduce the risk of recurrence? Then that arm, which would just be monitoring, so you're not doing anything, right, would be one option. And then the other option would be drug X. So think it's not placebo, right? That is, the standard of care was doing nothing in that regard. And then some patients will be randomized to that intervention, which is trying to see, is there a better option than doing nothing in that case? But we never, for ethical reasons, we would never give a patient, I don't want to say never, but majority of the time, and you will always know if you're going to be getting a placebo. That's the first thing. That's something that will have to be very transparent, right? So point one. But the other point, because it's breast cancer and because your life is on the line, it would very rarely be the case where you're going to be getting treatment that would be inferior to the standard of care.
Great, thank you. We have a couple questions on the chat. We'll get to them in a second. Actually, one of them that's directly linked to what we just talked about, and then I'll get to the other two. And just remind everybody, you can ask any question either via the Q&A button on Zoom or live on Facebook. As a researcher, do you have to prove that you have no financial benefit on the drug that is in the trial?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. You have to do your conflicts of disclosures, and that's critical because you always want to make sure, and that's something that's public, that's something that should be transparent. That way anyone can make sure that they know that does this researcher has any, and a lot of times, and I will tell you, a lot of times doctors have financial relationships, maybe consulting role, advisory role with a company that may not even have anything to do with X drug, but that information is definitely public and transparent. That way you as a patient will be able to see that and know that information.
Great, thank you. We got a couple questions on the chat that I think maybe we need to wait for San Antonio on some of them, but one is any updates on the CRISPR clinical trial for metastatic breast cancer, and then the other, which is more of also a treatment that may be a better question either through the app or to our next webinar, but I'll just pause it just in case. As a postmenopausal woman on Arimidex for 5 years, why don't I hear more about getting my uterus and ovaries removed to help prevent recurrence?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you mentioned, for the studies, I definitely think we have to wait for San Antonio to see some like what's coming down the pike. But
and maybe just on that point, Dr. Reid, just for people to know, so that are not very aware of San Antonio. So next week is a very large breast cancer conference, San Antonio Breast Cancer Conference, the largest in the world. So any updates on trials, any updates on drugs, essentially get published and presented at that conference. So since we're very close to that, that's essentially where everything will happen. And we at Outcomes for Me will be there live, but also we will be bringing you all this, including a webinar to discuss the results and ask any follow-up questions that's happening in a couple of weeks. But yeah.
Absolutely. So for postmenopausal patients, when we think about taking out one's ovaries to reduce the risk of recurrence, it's what we call ovarian suppression, essentially. We know that in premenopausal patients, ovarian suppression have been linked to increased improvement in survival or reduction in recurrence rates. That it has not been shown to be the case in postmenopausal patients, where we know in essence the ovarian function is already lower at that point. So there's not a lot of ovarian suppression, if you may. So we have not seen an improvement in outcomes with adding ovarian suppression, either surgically or with chemical ovarian suppression, if you may, with Lupron or Zoladex, et cetera.
Great, thank you. So now I want to move to the topic of cost and time commitment that's associated with clinical trials. But before I do that, Leanne, I see the question that was posed on the chat, which is linked to the conferences. So can anyone attend the breast cancer conferences, or is it only for medical and research professionals? So actually anyone can attend, and San Antonio, I know for patients and patient advocates, essentially you can attend for free.
That's
they
what I
have a
think.
process, yeah.
That's what I think. And I think it should be hybrid, where you can either do in person or virtual. So that's an option that most people can have access to it. I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure, but I think
actually,
it should be free.
Looked at it. We've looked at it, and but Leanne, if you want to follow up with our team or via the app, just ask the question. We're happy to provide more details around that. But there's a way to participate, including virtually, you said. Yes, because now with COVID, before it wasn't as virtual as now. A lot of the conferences allow the virtual option. And also one thing I should say for Outcomes for Me, I believe for San Antonio, because we checked, you could do it for free, but in general, because of our mission to really help you, every patient, feel empowered, we want to help with that participation in conferences. So if there are conferences that people are interested in and they're not sure how to get there, or if there's costs associated, we're happy to help in that process. So I just wanted to make sure, because it's always better to be better informed. So moving on now to the cost and time commitment. So are there costs associated with the clinical trial, if any, or will the health insurance cover, or the pharma company cover? Do you know how it works, or is it different from trial to trial?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are laws in place actually now that ensures that the routine costs that are usually going to be covered anyway, if you're going to be seen by your doctor, those routine costs should be covered by your health insurance. And there are actually policies in place that mandate that health insurances should still cover the routine standard of care costs. However, anything that's specific to that clinical trials, anything that goes above and beyond that routine care will then be absorbed. Those costs will be absorbed by the clinical trial. So whether that's a pharmaceutical sponsored trial, or that's NCI, et cetera, whatever that agency is that's actually running that clinical trial, they will then be responsible for any of those additional tests or additional drugs, et cetera. The patient should not absorb, not be paying any additional costs for being a part of the clinical trial. So whatever that routine cost that you would have been paying anyway, that should be covered by the insurance. So whatever co-pays or et cetera, that should not be anything in excess.
Great. And maybe linked to that, do you know if there's another question, will the trial cover the expenses if I get sick or have bad side effects due to the trial drug? Is that part of the drug, the associated trial cost?
We're talking about, for example, if you like get in the hospital or so, and that is why the insurance company is not completely unrelated from the study, right? That those costs will therefore be still covered as if you would get sick anyway by insurance. By get sick, then your insurance company will be a part of that. Will also be billed for anything that should come from that as well.
Okay, great, thank you. How long do clinical trials last?
I'll answer that, but the first thing I wanted to say, I kind of wanted to go back a little bit. I think the question about costs and billing should always be discussed upfront as well. So yeah. I absolutely recommend, before signing on that consent, asking those questions. Are there any surprises? Like, have you checked with my insurance company to make sure that, like, those are the questions that I think should be discussed. You should not get any surprise bill being on a clinical trial. And you should always make sure that you're having those upfront discussions before even consenting to a clinical trial. I totally believe that, because you don't want to have financial surprises as you're trying to explore better treatment options, right? Yeah. You asked about, I'm sorry, Maya, could you repeat?
So how long, in general, how long do trials take, go, or is it like a multi-year commitment, a few months commitment, or does it depend?
It absolutely depends on that trial, right? You have trials that are shorter, and you have trials that are going to be longer. For a patient that, for example, is on a trial, and I'll use the metastatic setting, you may be on that trial until the drug stops working. So for a specific patient, one patient may be on the trial for a longer period than another patient, depending on whether or not that drug is working for a longer period of time, right? And then you have other trials, especially in the early stage setting, that is very prescriptive. So you would know that you're going to be on that drug for 6 cycles, 4 cycles, et cetera. But in the metastatic setting, it's really going to be whether or not you have progression, then you would switch therapies, of course. Or if you have side effects that make you not tolerate the drug, then of course you're going to be off of that study. Or, and I always want to put there, that voluntary part. If you decide, I no longer want to be a part of this study, there's always that option to opt out at any point.
So actually, on that specific one, that's where the next question is what happens if I commit to a trial, but I don't like the experience after I start for whatever reason? How difficult is it to get out of my commitment?
Not difficult at all. You say, I don't want to do it anymore.
And it's as simple as that.
It's as simple as that. You have that right to decide to withdraw your consent at any part. There's sometimes some end of study procedures, and they sometimes may decide to follow your after you come off that trial, just to have that long-term data. But again, it's really up to you how much of that you do. And the good thing, I always say good practice, is of course to be able to follow that long-term data. But again, that is something that you have the right to dictate how much you want to participate going forward.
Great, thank you. So another question, which actually unfortunately is the case of many people, is about how far you can be from a trial. So the question is, I looked into a trial once, but I was so far from my home. Can I participate in one, but get most of my care at my usual cancer center so that I don't have to travel as much? And I know that's a huge pain point, because we're trying to get more patients on trial, go where patients are. Where do you see that going?
It's difficult, Maya. And a lot of the work I do is actually focused around this exact question, right? Because we know that more than 80% of our breast cancer patients are treated in the community, but most of our trials are at academic centers. And I think we have to fix that problem because, someone mentioned earlier, I love my team. That's important. You want to have patients stay where they are, not have to uproot them and have travel costs and all that, right? So the ideal would be to have a clinical trial in every community, right, center where most of our patients are receiving care, but that's unfortunately not the case a lot of times. So to answer the question more specifically, can I do both? Can I be able to stay close to home and be a part of the trial far away from home? It's usually difficult. Usually. COVID has, however, made some of that change quite a bit, because now we realize that there's maybe some telehealth that can happen. There's maybe some even virtual consenting. So I wouldn't say it's as hard and fast as it was before. And I think that is changing little by little because we are realizing that we can actually utilize some of this telemedicine platforms where patients may not be having to travel every month or every 2 weeks, etc., that we can spread out the times in between with supplementing sometimes with telehealth visits. So I think if you were even told that at one point, revisit that conversation. You'd be maybe surprised at the options that are now available now with post the COVID era, now that we have more telehealth resources in place.
Great, thank you. And actually, if you do have to travel, would the trial pay for the hotel, the cost, the travel cost, or of people coming from outside of town, or that's depends on each trial?
I want to say it depends, of course, because I don't know every trial and the different budgetary restrictions, but most trials actually have in their budget resources, resource allocation for travel, lodging, etc., because we want to always support patients that are coming from afar, coming from rural areas, community sites, etc. So a lot of time, that budget is already kind of accounted for. So always ask before you decide that I can. Sometimes we reimburse, patients for meals, travel, etc. So that's absolutely a part of some of the things that we think about upfront when writing these trials, trying to make sure that we have some reimbursement budgeting already thought of upfront.
Great. We got a question on the chat, but I think this is another question that I think we need to look into, not on the webinar or, as a follow-up, but I'll just ask it just in case. Is, have they finalized the trial that includes metformin usage in reducing recurrence, or simvastatin was another one they were trialing?
Yeah, have they finalized it? Is that the question?
Yeah.
I guess I'll have to say, I don't know.
Yeah, so that's something that I think, the person that asked that we can research it for you. If please follow up with us without Cancer Me, or it's something we can look, which is also part of the services we provide.
Yeah. What I will say about metformin, we have definitely investigated metformin use to reduce the risk of a recurrence, because we know insulin resistance and all of that pathophysiology as we know it at this point, right? We have not, I think, gotten as much headway as we had thought we would have gotten, but I think there's still some trials coming down the pike looking at metformin usage, even in combination with other agents. So I'm not sure of the exact trial that person was mentioning, but metformin has been a big part of the breast cancer story for a while now.
Great. So before we close out, I wanted to kind of step back a little bit and kind of get your perspective in terms of, I think we've covered pretty well, we've covered why trials are important, especially in breast cancer and in cancer in general. There's sometimes the best treatment options. There's a lot of care that happens when people are on trial. So even if they don't end up on the drug, if they end up on the standard of care, there's still much more surveillance and more scans than they would get normally, just because of how trials work. But also, we hear a lot today in the news and across that, having a broad participation in trial is also important in terms of understanding how the drugs work. So I want to kind of, get your thoughts on more, kind of diversity in trials, who should participate, how do we make sure, what should happen in terms of, making sure that the drugs that ends up being on the market have been really kind of, optimized, if you will, or developed for, the population they're going to.
Yeah, I can't stress this enough. This is a problem. We have significant underrepresentation of minority patients in clinical trials, and that's outside of cancer, in cancer, and even in breast cancer clinical trials. We have not enough Black and Brown patients in clinical trials. We don't have enough patients from underserved communities in clinical trials that look like the population, right? And that's a problem because these are the drugs, and that's how I started. The drugs you're getting today is a clinical trial yesterday, right? So we have to make sure that when we're designing these clinical trials, we're not putting in place barriers that's essentially excluding some of these patients that will be receiving these drugs. And I think that's something that I'm super passionate about, trying to ensure that we're increasing representation across diverse groups in our clinical trials. But I think we have to be intentional because we already know that there are significant survival disparities where, for example, Black patients are more likely to die from breast cancer. So we have to start looking into it more intentionally. Can we then make sure that we're including these groups in our clinical trials to better understand why are we seeing these disparities? Are the drugs working the same across different racial ethnic groups? And I think it's really something that we have to really ensure that we're having a health equity and being accountable to our patients to make sure that that our research reflects a diverse breast cancer cohort, essentially.
And maybe to that, and that would be my last question before we wrap it up, is because, Outcomes for Me, we are about democratizing healthcare. We are committed to do everything we can to help every patient, wherever they are, whoever they are, get to the best outcome possible given where the latest science is. So on that topic, anything or any advice or anything that you think we at Outcomes for Me could help in terms of actually kind of helping getting the patients that are not getting on the trial to either, understand why they're important or get there, or if there's data lacking that we should help collect so that we change that, so that we can get, because as you said, when we look at the breast cancer, there's a lot of disparities in outcome, and it starts with research.
Absolutely. So I think, there are multiple strategies, right? From the patient to the provider to the system, right? Because there are different barriers across the spectrum. But I think if we're thinking about from a patient standpoint, I always say it starts with awareness, education, and being your advocate, right? Making sure that if you're not being told about a trial, excuse me, is there a trial that I will fit either here or elsewhere? It's a simple question that I think every patient needs to make sure that they're having that discussion. It takes a minute, right? So I think from a patient standpoint, having that awareness that clinical trials are critical to moving the field forward and actually also to improve the care you're getting is important. And that conversation, I think, starts even before you have cancer, even knowing someone else and being sensitized to what a clinical trial is. That way, when you hear the term, you don't go thinking about the myths or some of the misconception. I think having that general awareness and these kind of platforms that you're doing, Maya, I think does that. So patients understand, okay, clinical trials is not what I thought. So when someone brings it up, you don't have that kind of like that wall up to say, no, I don't want to be a guinea pig, or some of the other thoughts that patients have had because of real issues that have happened in the past. So I think is really trying to be aware of what is a clinical trial, and making sure that you are being offered, and if not offered, that you're asking.
Great, thank you very much. So first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Reid, for taking the time with us. I think it's been an invaluable discussion. I want to thank everybody that has submitted a question that is live and has submitted ahead of time. I know we've gotten a number of questions about people that couldn't make it but want to listen to the recording, which we'll make available on the app in a few days. If you have any follow-up questions or thoughts, please email us at questions@outcomesforme.com. We will send out a survey also, so please give us feedback. You know, we essentially base the topics of these Ask the Experts based on the feedbacks and what you want to hear. And finally, to make sure you don't miss any future updates, please make sure not, to have enable push notification on the app. We always update things on the app before as we have them. And as I briefly mentioned, we're going to have another webinar following San Antonio on the latest on breast cancer, and that's coming in a few weeks. Thank you again, Dr. Reid. This has been really very informative and very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks.